Hello. So for me, living in the United States, there are two kind of strangers, really. There are the kind of strangers that come up to me on the street and say, you're that guy from YouTube. That's a new development since this channel took off. And then recently, or rather previously, there had been those people who hear my accent and then respond accordingly, but they always respond in different ways. And it's in this video that I just want to touch on some of the ways that they do respond. Before I get underway though, I do want to say, just to clarify for anyone who might be British who's thinking of moving to the United States, that most of the time, nobody's going to even mention your accent. It doesn't come up all the time, but there are just those instances when you might say the word water instead of water, and you can see the cogs turning in the person who you are addressing, and their eyes bulge before they ask any kind of question about your accent. It's those people that I want to speak about today, and just some of the, I suppose, typical responses that I hear again and again whenever my accent is clocked. Surprisingly, when I moved here, one of the sort of common questions that I got a lot was, why would you move here of all places? And I always found that really strange, but at the same time I thought about it and I thought, well, I think most of us have a view of our homeland or even hometown that can be both, positive and negative. We might be proud of some of the things it's achieved or done, but we might also see its shortcomings in a way that perhaps somebody coming to the country isn't aware of yet. And those people try to sort of instill that sense in me that, all is not well here. Why would you move to this country? And I think there are natural pessimists in the world, and I can see where that line of questioning comes from, especially since there is a kind of romanticism for England and all it entails. Whether that fantasism presents itself through a kind of royal outlook or a Jane Austen novel or a picturesque countryside. Britain itself, of course, is not devoid of its own problems. And I think that's something that often gets forgotten about in this conversation. But for every pessimist, of course, you do have an optimist. And that brings us on to this. I don't know if this means that Americans by their very nature are more optimistic than everyone else, but this seems to be the question that I get the most. And it is usually phrased exactly like this. So how do you like it here? Now, if I'm not yet particularly friendly with that person, or it's just a sort of casual chat, I probably give a kind of one-word response like, it's great. That's 2 words, but you get my drift. That, in summary, is kind of how I feel about this. But sometimes if I get into a more broad conversation with, say, a family member or a friend, I might delve deep into kind of why I enjoy it. Obviously, America's been going through a kind of a tough time in the last few years. And of course, with COVID, that's just been exacerbated. But I think that's the same with my homeland too. So they're on a level playing field in that regard. But as I've said on this channel before, there are other elements of America that I've long appreciated and continue to appreciate since I've moved here. And it usually is those things I gravitate toward. Things like the topography of this country, so the landscape, the mountains, the rivers, the Great Plains, everything about it from a geological standpoint is of unique interest to me. But of course, not just that. I mean, there are other elements to American culture that are fascinating and that I cover in these videos. And I've always found that the best way to learn about a place is to immerse yourself in it. And that's what I've chosen to do over the last few years. This, I suppose, is the sort of answer that I now give to people. When I was new to the country, though, it was quite a bit different because I was still naive to the way this country worked. And so when I saw neon signs everywhere, it felt like everything was Las Vegas, just without all of the gambling. Of course, that's not how it is at all. It's just that these neon signs are everywhere in the Midwest for things like Applebee's, McDonald's, Burger King and things like that. But initially that was really exciting. Over time, it sort of grew old when you realize that every single city in the Midwest has those along their main highways. But at first, those were the kind of answers that I would give, and people would be sort of stunned, I think, in wide-eyed wonder at just how naive I was. I think the excitement for living in the US hasn't dissipated, despite all of the strife. I suppose I am looking at it, though, from an angle that a lot of people aren't, and that's because it is also my job. So I immerse myself in just Americanness and American stuff. And so when somebody asks, how do you like it here so far? A decade or more in, it's going well. Now, I said at the top of this video that most Americans aren't even going to remark on your accent, and fewer still are going to do this. Nonetheless, occasionally some people will get very excited, right? Some would say too excited. Not me, I like it. And they'll hear accent and they'll want you to say certain words in that accent. That's kind of their way of, I guess, breaking the ice with you or turning you into a robot. I've had people ask me to say tomato, the obvious one, squirrel, banana, pasta. These are all food items except squirrel. Aluminium, Vincent van Gogh. And a moment ago, I wasn't joking, I sort of do like this in a really weird way. I can see how people might take offense to it, might feel like they are being sort of objectified or turned into, as I said, a robot or a performing monkey. But I do find it's a weird icebreaker. I think for somebody like me who is an introvert, it's an easy way to, I don't know, not have to think too hard about the things I have to say. You don't really make too many lasting friendships this way though. And I'm thinking, just to make this easier, maybe I should just make a video of all of the uniquely British pronunciations and then just hand it to them and walk away. That would seem rude. I get a lot of people asking me which part of the UK are you from, and this one can be sort of a tricky one to answer because anybody who's not from the UK, it doesn't matter if you're American or anywhere else in the world, there are going to be parts of the place that are just unknown to outsiders. And my hometown is likely one of those. It's called Grimsby. It is in the northeast-ish of England, but it's, you know, it's up here to point to it kind of in the UK. And there's a reason I'm showing you this because one time a relative here in the US asked this very question, which part of the UK are you from? And he, you know, just sort of admitted, I really don't know much about the UK except for kind of where London is. Can you show me on your hand? And I held up my hand. I said, London is kind of here-ish. And I was from here, right? And so after he asked me to do that, any other time that somebody said, where are you from, Lawrence, in the UK, I'd always put up my hand. But one day I was on a business trip in Idaho and a person asked me with complete enthusiasm that very same question. And I held up my hand, sure as always, pointed to my hometown, only for them to say, I lived in England for 10 years. Suddenly all of the love went out of their eyes. It was as if I'd been patronizing them for the past 2 minutes. So I haven't done the hand thing since. This one can be tricky, right? It's rare, but ever so occasionally, an American will mistake my accent for perhaps an Australian or a New Zealander. And they'll usually do it with the utmost enthusiasm, as in, I've never met a genuine Australian person before. I want to give you a hug. And the dilemma for me is that I'm British, and a lot of us, myself included, we have these politeness norms that we feel we have to adhere to. We don't want to let people down, right? So I sort of just go along with it most of the time. A good example of this is when I worked in a call center. It happened a lot there because all they get is your voice. And this one person, by coincidence, or at least he thought, was going to Australia the next day, and I was helping him to program his cell phone to use in Australia. And he couldn't believe his luck that he'd got what he thought was an Australian on the phone. And I couldn't ruin that for him. So I went along with it. It even got to the point of him inviting me to go with him. And so by the end of it, I was almost convinced to get a ticket to go to my hometown of Perth. And then I ended the call, some of the best work I've ever done. He went away happy, but I lied. Now, I just want to clarify because I think it could be perceived that Americans are quite ignorant for making that error. I don't know, because here's the thing. Growing up in England, we grew up with a lot of Australian soap operas. So the Australian accent is by no means unfamiliar to us, and we can tell it very much apart from our own. And I can see how, just to the untrained ear, those would sound the same. It's sort of like how I think a lot of British people, myself included before I moved here, wouldn't be able to tell the difference really between most southern US dialects, for example, right? But there are several of those, and we don't know that either. So we just think everybody's from Texas if they have a southern drawl of some kind. I genuinely take no offense if somebody thinks I'm Australian, but I do draw the line at people who think I'm from Scunthorpe. That joke will only work with about 3 people. That's it for this episode. Let me know in the comments below what you'd ask if you overhear my accent. I'm Lawrence Brown. You can follow me on Twitter, and don't forget to subscribe to my channel so that you don't miss any more Vlogmas episodes. Finally, a huge shout out to my patrons who make these videos possible. If you would like to become a patron of Lost in the Pond, you can do so today at patreon.com/lostinthepond. Until tomorrow's video, goodbye.